Hello, and welcome to this UCL Lunch Hour lecture. I am delighted to have you all here joining us today. Thank you. Today, we'll be just exploring the topic, how can we shape public institutions to meet the challenges of the next decade, globally, nationally, and in cities, and without using a chainsaw. My name is Dr. Kate Roll. I'm an associate professor at the Institute of Innovation and Public Purpose at University College London, UCL. And it is my honor and absolute pleasure to introduce today's speaker, Professor Sir Jeff Mulgan. As you may already know, Jeff is a professor at UCL's STEEP department. He has brought his wide-ranging expertise to governments and multilateral organizations around the world. Most notably, however, he served as director of the UK government strategy unit and head of policy at the Prime Minister's office. He also supported civil society organizations as a CEO of Nesta, the UK's National Endowment for Science, Technology, and the Arts. His pioneering work, has been in fields including social innovation, collective intelligence, and the creative economy. And his past books include Big Mind, How Collective Intelligence Can Change the World with Princeton University Press, Another World is Possible, How to Reignite Social and Political Imagination from OUP, and When Science Meets Power from Polity Press most recently. So we're just absolutely delighted to have him here. Before we begin, before I pass over to Jeff, I want to let you know that there'll be time at the end of the lecture to have an interactive Q&A. And you're welcome to enter questions at the end of the talk or during the talk. You can do this by using the Slido link, sli.do link, which was included in your Eventbrite invitation, as well as by going to the site Slido, sli.do, and entering #change to access this event. But without further ado, I'm delighted once again to welcome you all to the UCL Lunch Hour Lecture and to pass over to Jeff for his talk. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Kate. So glad you could chair this, and thank you all for joining on a weekday lunchtime as you munch your sandwiches or whatever. As Kate said, I've got a background partly as an academic, so I'm a professor in the engineering department at UCL, but mainly as a bureaucrat. I've worked in local government, in national governments, and the European Commission. And so part of me, therefore, lives the world of institutions, but I've also always found institutions and bureaucracy slightly uncomfortable in many ways. And it's the paradox of this lunchtime in a way that we have this strange relationship with our institutions. And indeed, in the English language, being institutionalized means you've been locked up because you're a threat to society, which is perhaps a symptom of how we feel about things. So what I'm going to do is talk through really some work in progress about how we might reimagine our institutions to serve us better. And I'm going to try and persuade you of three things. First of all, that we have a problem, quite a serious problem with our public institutions, pretty much all over the world. And as Kate said, at local level, national and transnational, that there are some good answers to that problem and some potentially radically new ways of thinking about what institutions could be. And that actually, if you care about anything else in the world, whether it's the future of the planet, climate, peace, democracy, you've actually got to take some account of what institutions can best serve those broader goals in the world. But I hope as well that you will disagree with some of what I say, and I hope we'll have a lively conversation at the end, because as I say, this is, for me, work in progress. I have as many questions as answers. The background, in a sense, is obvious. All of us live our lives surrounded by institutions which affect pretty much everything we do, from the primary school maybe your kids are at, the NHS, the railway system, which is about to be nationalised in the UK. And there's an old saying about buildings, that we shape our buildings and then our buildings shape us. And I think the same is true of institutions. We shape them at crucial moments in history, but then they shape us. They determine how we act, how we think, how we live. And some of you will know who this guy is. He's not really a household name. His name is Darren Acemoglu, and he won the Nobel Prize for Economics last year for an argument that institutions aren't just very much part of our daily lives, they actually are decisive in shaping which societies thrive, which grow, which prosper. And this is one of his most influential pieces, Institutions as a Fundamental Cause of Long Run Growth. And in a way, I was prompted by the work he and others did, and they were looking at the past, at institutions designed 40, 50, 60 years ago, and how those influence societal success today. And I thought, well, if he's right about the past, probably the same is true today, that those societies which best shape their institutions in the mid 2020s are the ones most likely to be happy and prosperous in 2050. So that's in a way the prompt for much of this work. He hasn't done much on design in the present. It's much more backward looking analysis, but it is very important. And let's say it was recognized by the Nobel Prize Committee last year. And in a sense, what lies behind his work is the history of an extraordinary number of institutions which have shaped the world. This is France's École maternelle, set up in the 19th century to drive up birth rates quite successfully, a topic which is very live in many countries around the world now as birth rates fall. This is one of the many institutions Singapore developed very successfully, the Central Provident Fund, managing housing and pensions and welfare and creating a pool of capital for the economy. Many of you will be familiar with DARPA, set up in the US in the 1950s to do radical technology innovation. The internet came out of DARPA, and recently several countries, including the UK and Germany, have tried to copy DARPA with new agencies to do high risk innovation. And in a country like the UK, our daily lives are very much shaped by big public institutions like the NHS and, of course, the BBC, perhaps even more important now in an era of misinformation, fake news, and so on. So there is a kind of positive story to be told, which we all know, and each individual institution has a complicated story. But I think if you ask our fellow citizens, and maybe you too, and you think, what do you picture when you think of institutions? It's probably a bit more like this. This is a statue I love in Reykjavik in Iceland. It's the unknown bureaucrat. And this is how many people see bureaucracies. They are, blind, rock solid, immovable, unresponsive, everything you wouldn't want to have a lovable or useful institution around you. And if you look globally, public institutions are on average not in a great state. This is a survey from last year done by Edelman, looking at businesses, NGOs, and government. And if you look at the far left-hand, bottom left-hand corner, you'll see that overall governments are seen as not only less competent than NGOs and business, much less competent than business, but also less ethical. So we're in a rather uncomfortable period when the very institutions which are meant to serve us and solve complex problems are not seen as either effective or as very worthy of trust. And that, of course, is why we get phenomena like the perhaps not so lamented Doge. I don't know if Doge did die last week, but with Elon Musk's departure. But the fact that his wielding of the chainsaw and that of Milei in Argentina and others around the world, that does strike a chord with at least some of the public who want to see quite a vigorous, even vicious approach to bureaucrats and bureaucracies. What Musk was doing was part of a broader program set out in Project 25. I'm one of the probably relatively few people in the world who's actually read this bizarre document, which set out the mission for the Trump administration, which committed to dismantle the administrative state and return self-governance to the American people. It explicitly says to go back to an 18th century model where government just doesn't do very much. Now, that is one possible response to the present. I don't think it's a very plausible response. And Doge quickly fell over itself and didn't, in fact, touch most of the really big spending programs in the US. But that is at least one possible route we might go in the future. Perhaps the next government in the UK might be a bit more similar to this than the current one. The question, which then flows from all of this, and array the question to all of you is, what should a 21st century state public sector look like? How can it be competent, ethical, and trusted? And are you in favor of revolution? Should we get rid of everything, start from scratch, or evolution or reform? What's the right approach to take? And I'm hoping in our discussion you might put yourself in the shoes, perhaps of a Starmer or a Mertz or someone who has to make these decisions and decide what kind of state actually is fitted for the purposes, the tasks the public want achieved. And I'll talk a bit later about some of the ways of thinking, not just in pyramid structures like on the left, but also more organic structures like sort of myceliums and corals, and also the ideas coming out of technology and computer science of meshes, platforms, and stacks, and how those may be pointers to a very different kind of state in the future. Now, the truth is that most governments around the world, and all of us have some experience of them, are not a million miles away from the kind of image of Hobbes's Leviathan. This is the frontispiece of his book 400 or so years ago, where the state sits at the top of society and is made up essentially of a series of pyramid-like organograms, like most businesses, which have a minister or CEO at the top and then a series of cascading boxes downwards. Most of us have grown up with this as the norm for organizations, but I hope to persuade you that's not the only way you can run things, and there are some very different options. And what makes this discussion interesting now is that although we have in the center of every capital city around the world these buildings, I don't know how many of these cities you can identify, they're kind of fairly similar government buildings in different countries, from China to Russia to the US to Germany and the UK, with these, again, usually the most senior people on the top floor, endless corridors, very rigid hierarchies, and pretty impermeable to the public. You're not really encouraged to go into these if you're an ordinary member of the public. I think that kind of way of doing government is becoming increasingly anachronistic. And there are alternatives. And some of the alternatives in the last 20 years have arisen in business. Every day we use these businesses based on platforms like Airbnb or Didi, on search like Google, or AI like OpenAI, Anthropic, and so on. And also very different business models like Arm in microchips, one of the most successful UK-based companies, which doesn't manufacture itself. It's part of a much more complex web of licensing, which has transformed how business is organized. So if nothing else, you don't have to copy these models. Business has shown you can imagine organizations in very, very different ways from perhaps General Motors or ICI, or for that matter, a traditional government department. And all over the world, there are business schools with centers focusing on organizational design and the different options, the different ways of running things. There's also been incredible imagination in civil society in the last 20 years. I mean, every day, probably many of you use Wikipedia, a collective intelligence-based platform with millions of volunteers in place of the old companies doing encyclopedias. My very first job was selling encyclopedias door to door, long before Wikipedia. We couldn't even imagine that very different way of doing things. There are new ideas like DAOs, decentralized autonomous organizations, tens of thousands of them using blockchain as a very different organizational tool. There are citizen science initiatives like Zoe. Again, many of you may map your microbiome with Zoe and share the results. There are new legal forms like the Community Interest Company I helped write the legislation for here in the UK, or B Corps, trying to show how you can be sort of halfway between a commercial company and a traditional NGO, and innumerable other kind of networks and organizations in global civil society. So lots of imagination there, but in many ways rather less in the public sector. And this was the prompt about a year or two ago for me and a group of other people to set up what we call the Institutional Architecture Lab to try and clarify what was happening, what the problem was, but also what some of the ways of organizing and designing institutions differently could be. And we're a classic networked organization, very small, but based in Brazil, India, the US, Finland, UK, South Africa, and using new tools to work with governments and others on this kind of design. And one of our starting points was to try and at least map those public sector institutional innovations, which could be relevant, could be, useful prompts for thinking differently. And we couldn't find anyone who'd quite done that. And we found that most people working in governments around the world, they'd all heard of Airbnb and Wikipedia and Google, of course, but they weren't aware of the equivalents in the public sector. So we've put out a whole series of case studies on everything from heat officers and new ways of organizing time to data governance and so on. And I'll give a flavor of a few of these before moving on to how we might design in the future. So here are a few examples we've studied. One of the most dramatic is the whole program of investment in technology development, which China's done in the last 20 years through what are called government guidance funds. And there's about 1,500 or so of these funds, huge funds like the China Internet Investment Fund, deploying enormous sums of money. It's estimated well over $1 trillion equivalent into these. And they are part of the reason why China has been so extraordinarily successful in tech in the last 10 or 20 years with things like DeepSeek. And it's a very different model from the US or Europe. And at the very least, it's one worth learning from. We've looked in a very different front at ways of organizing care from the care blocks in Colombia. This is a map of the city of Bogota, which organizes these care support blocks, partly to support carers, and the extraordinarily radical Utopias program in Mexico City, providing integrated services, mainly in poor areas of the city, but at very high quality. I'd love to see a little bit more, something more utopia-like back in the UK. A very different example comes from Sweden, protecting against the new threats which we all face from cyber attack, and in this case, psychological warfare. This is their psychological warfare agency. We don't, again, have one in most countries yet, but it's a way of thinking about institutional responses to new kinds of demand, new kinds of need and threat. There's the beginnings of a whole army of new regulators of artificial intelligence across the world. China's was the first, the Cyberspace Administration, set up 12, 13 years ago, initially to regulate the internet, but increasingly regulating AI with very, very detailed laws and rules. And Spain is the first in Europe to create AICA, a regulator of AI, and most other countries will have something in this space in the next few years. The UK, again, has decided not to, but I'm fairly certain we'll get there at some point. There are many institutions or teams within governments who don't just write policies or recommend laws, but actually make tools. And I think this is a very interesting shift in the last 10 or 15 years. One of my colleagues in Teal ran A2I in Bangladesh, which is one of the best in the world, who created a whole host of digital tools to support the nearly 200 million people in Bangladesh, to digitize, to make public services much more accessible. And here in the UK, there's a rather good, I think, incubator for artificial intelligence in Downing Street, again, making products rather than just recommending things. There's a family of institutions, again, something which I think we need in London in particular, which try to orchestrate the brain power of a city to help solve city problems. Amsterdam is probably the best example in Europe with Open Research Amsterdam. China, again, has had some very good examples. And these aren't rocket science, but they're just trying to systematize the identification of priority needs, priority problems, and then to orchestrate mixed teams of officials, NGOs, and also academics to work on problem solving. It's kind of an obvious thing to do in a big city. It just happens that cities like London don't have this kind of capability. And then there's the fascinating field of how to represent future generations in today's decisions. It's nearly 10 years since Wales passed its Wellbeing of Future Generations Act, which created a new post of Future Generations Commissioner. They're now on their second commissioner. And if you're interested, Teal published quite a big report last year on all of these future generations models. And shortly after, the European Commission, Ursula von der Leyen, announced that the EU would have its own Future Generations Commissioner, who was then appointed a few months later. And you can see a picture of him there, who has a rather difficult job of representing tens, if not hundreds of millions of unborn people, but to ensure that their interests are not ignored when crucial decisions are being made about things like climate change or infrastructure. And there's then a sort of global side of this. Again, we've documented many of the more recent global institutions and also some of the gaps. And this is one of my favorite, Icarus, a collective intelligence project linking thousands, if not millions of birds to monitor the biosphere of the world, and also some cows. They have sensitive cows which can spot earthquakes coming and things like that. Completely mind-blowing, unimaginable even 10 or 15 years ago, but part of a family of new global institutions to help us navigate through a much more interconnected and fragile world. So and then I should say finally, there's a lot of teams within governments driving innovation, like the government laboratory in Chile's government, which has now been going 10 years. Strange ones like the Ministry of Possibilities in UAE, in Dubai. The GDS in the UK, which has been a pioneer of innovation within the UK government. And then 100 accelerator labs backed by the UNDP all over the world, trying to catalyze much more creative thinking about how to solve problems. So in one sense, there's an enormous amount of fertility and creativity out there. But if you go to most governments, they look pretty much the same as they did in 1990 or 1970. And the models, the defaults are pretty much the same as they were when I started working in local government or national government quite a long time ago. And whenever a new institution is being created, it comes out with a plan which looks pretty much like that kind of organogram, as if they're not even aware there are other options. And when there are reorganizations, Lego is, I think, the main inspiration. And we're about to go through another phase of this in the UK, where the building blocks are simply taken apart and put back together. And this happens repeatedly with regulators and agencies or the NHS. It's just merging and splitting. It's almost a complete absence of imagination about institutional forms, but it takes up an enormous amount of energy as these reorganizations periodically happen and almost never have much effect on results. So I think this matters because I think around us there are many, many governance gaps. There are tasks needing good governance, good bureaucracy, good institutions, which are missing them. They range from mental health compared to physical health, misinformation, navigating changes of jobs, procurement, and at a global level, issues like space, oceans, and so on. So what I've been working on with some colleagues in the last year, particularly with the UNDP and others globally, is the development of a set of methods and frameworks and tools to escape from that tyranny of the old kind of pyramid organogram. And this is something we published in March, which you can find online, which is a tool, a set of methods for thinking creatively about design. And I'm going to give you a flavor of some of the thinking before we then go to discussion. One starting point is just to encourage governments to think differently about the methods of design. So certainly most European governments or Canada or Latin America, when they're thinking about a new task, let's say we've got to drive up the birth rate, which is a very live issue, as I said, in many places. Um, Often their default is to create a committee. That committee will make some kind of recommendation. A law will then be passed, a new institution announced, and then a board or a committee is formed for that institution. It then appoints a chief executive, and then they kind of create their organogram downwards. That's the standard in Britain. It's the standard in most countries. And it's sometimes a good way to do things, but it's definitely not the only way. And I'll just give you a flavor of one alternative way, which is kind of obvious and happens all the time in other sectors, which is you learn by doing. You create something initially quite small, but it moves directly into practice. It does stuff. Stage gate one at the left you see there. If it's successful, you then grow it. Maybe you adapt it in the light of experience. You get a bigger budget, more goals, more formality, and so on through a series of steps. And maybe you only pass your law several stages on when you've really learned a lot about what's needed, what will work. It's essentially an evolutionary, organic, biological way of thinking about institutions. It's mainly what happens in business startups. And it's not always possible in government, but it is much more often possible than people realize. And I've been so depressed on many times being asked by governments around the world to help out on a committee, uh, thinking of some new task. And 2 years later, this committee is still meeting and nothing's actually happened. And I think that's one of the reasons the public get a bit frustrated sometimes with bureaucracy. There's then a whole host of different ways of thinking beyond the traditional options of ministries, agencies, regulators, commissions, PPPs, and so on. And I hope to give you a sort of flavor of some of those different options. We've argued that most of the next generation public institutions will have intelligence at their core. That's to say, they'll be partly about providing knowledge, data, insight to the systems they're part of. And there are some examples of this. We have, in a way, a precursor here in the UK with NICE, which judges the effectiveness and cost effectiveness of all health treatments to help the NHS and provides all of that to doctors and nurses. But there are others which go further. So New Zealand has the integrated data infrastructure, probably the most advanced combination of multiple data sets to understand what's happening in society. And that then allows more detailed analysis, for example, of, in this case, older people's well-being, a study from a few months ago. There are many, many other examples of intelligence-led organizations. And one of my favorites is this one based in India, the International Solar Alliance, formed about 10 years ago, with the job of driving up solar adoption across the global south, the sunny global south. And it essentially is an intelligence assembly, an orchestrator of data, of knowledge, of analyses. It provides training, it provides evidence support to about 80 to 90 countries now. And it's a synthesizer of complex knowledge to help a system to be much more effective. And I love the ISA in part because it makes you wonder, why on earth don't we have something like that for care for the elderly, let's say, or for nursery provision? Most public activity fields do not have anything remotely as systematic as an intelligence orchestrator as the ISA. The next theme, which comes up again and again, is the fact that we now need institutions which are like meshes. They link multiple tiers of government, maybe national, city, very local, and also horizontally in a mesh. That's quite different from traditional public administration. It's beginning to be acted on in the UK government through its recently started test and learn approach, which is part of national government working with localities to test out new ideas. But it's still a fairly alien concept to most national government departments. And yet it is how many of our most effective technology systems increasingly work. And one of my sort of side roles is often advising governments on how to do whole of government, horizontal, joined up organization, where there's a whole host of tools available to ensure the system is more coherent horizontally as well as vertically. Again, most of these aren't used or even known by most governments, but one of their goals is to achieve that mesh type thinking and structure. A stage beyond that is thinking of institutions as stacks. So if you've got a computer science background, you'll be very familiar with the stack of communications, which goes from the physical up through applications layers and software. That has been used by India to completely rethink its use of public services and identity. And the Aadhaar ID card, probably the biggest public innovation project of the last 20 years. And that thinking is now being applied to other fields. Europe is considering a Euro stack. That's a picture on the left of the Euro stack. Some countries like Singapore have gov tech stacks. And the point is, when you think in this stack where you don't have to have every task, every function in a single institution, you can separate them out. And we're beginning to apply this to urban regeneration, things like that, where you might have a stack approach to the rebuilding regeneration of a city. Another related example is thinking of platforms and protocol-based institutions. So the internet is now pretty much 60 years old, and the World Wide Web is 30 years old, and they're entirely based on protocols of interconnection rather than a single institution owning everything. And this thinking is being applied to some very new fields. Again, India's often in the forefront with things like the Open Network for Digital Commerce, which provides a public platform which overlays the commercial platforms like taxi providers and others. And there's increasing application of this way of thinking to energy networks and energy systems so that they can allow many more people and players to sell energy into the system and for consumers to buy energy out. Again, it's a shift of mental models, very different from traditional, have a nuclear power station, a coal power station, and then a distribution grid to the home. This is 21st century thinking about how a network can be intelligent. And then in our work with governments, we often found this is the most sort of useful metaphor to help people think afresh, is to think of myceliums, mushrooms, fungi, which are the largest organisms on the planet. And as you understand mushrooms, you realize they support each other, but there's often an under the surface reality and network very different from what you see above ground. And this may sound a bit abstract as a way of organizing public services, but a good example is the care provider Buurtzorg in the Netherlands, which has about 20,000 social workers. And they essentially use this model for organizing themselves. They also sometimes use the metaphor of the onion. So it's the individual needing support right at the core, but it's very different from a traditional pyramid bureaucracy and much more flexible and much more human in nature. A lot of our work recently has been about institutions which are essentially there to provide guidance or coaching or advice to the public. The top right is a Bangladeshi one, NICE, the National Intelligence sort of System for Skills, Education and Employment. It's one I think every country will need, or already does need, orchestrating intelligence on how to cope with dramatic changes in jobs, mainly thanks to AI, but crucially turning that into navigation tools to help 15-year-olds or 50-year-olds to work out what skills they might need to have a reasonable job in 10 years' time. And we take some inspiration from commercial services like TikTok, which provide algorithmic but personalized guidance to you as an individual. And I see no reason why what has worked commercially so well for entertainment couldn't work for things like financial literacy, careers guidance, health guidance, and so on. And I think that could be part of the next generation of public institutions. And in a way, those are conversational. There's another kind of conversational institution where its engagement with the public is core to its work. One of the British institutions I've most admired for many years is the Human Fertilization and Embryology Authority, set up in the 90s to regulate things like IVF and cloning and so on. But right from the start, it came out of a huge public debate and parliamentary debate because there are so many difficult ethical issues involved. And it was charged with continuing to maintain that dialogue with the public about the choices to be made. And I think, again, this is a model for the 21st century. It's weird we have nothing like this for the internet or for AI, but it's part of the family of institutions we will increasingly need. Now, at Teal, we've been trying to sort of document, as I say, many of the cases, to do white papers on things like AI procurement. I mentioned future generations, new kinds of global institution, and trying to, in a sense, expand the menu of options. And this is one example I did with Alish Kapp, who's a PhD student at UCL. And here we were looking at the problem that so many elections can easily be undermined by some fake news, fake video, and almost every election now does have some of these incidents. And no country has a capacity to respond very quickly in real time. So we did quite a detailed design for what we called electoral integrity institutions, using a mixture of collective intelligence and AI and other tools to very quickly spot if there is a bit of deep fake media, pretending a politician has done something appalling. So you can quickly identify it, assess it, analyze it, and if necessary, block it from the internet, from the platforms. Nowhere's yet done this, but I don't see how democracy can easily survive without some new kinds of institution to protect us against the many, many, many threats. So just a couple of final comments before we open up. So one is about ethos. As I've worked in bureaucracies for many decades, I've increasingly realized there was something wrong, I guess, with our mental models. And this was crystallized for me when I saw the work of the Japanese architect Shigeru Ban, who's an amazing architect who makes buildings mainly out of cardboard, often in disaster zones. And this is one of his cathedrals built out of cardboard. And in the work of him and many other architects, they're trying to achieve strength without weight. So you still have a really effective building, but it doesn't need anything like as much mass. And I think, in a way, that's the ethos we need for the next generation of public institutions. Lightness, flexibility, agility, intelligence, but without the heavy weight of traditional pyramids. And in material science, there's a very parallel current. I mean, graphene is probably the most famous example of a material designed to achieve strength without weight. Incredibly light, but incredibly strong, and already appearing in quite a few materials and products. And that, in a sense, is the aesthetic we need for our new institutions. And if you're interested, I wrote quite a long piece about what that means in practice. And I'll just conclude with a series of questions, which I don't really know the answer to, but maybe Kate can answer them, or maybe you can. And the first one comes up again and again whenever we start this conversation in different countries. What should be the rate of change? Should we get rid of all our institutions? How much should we emphasize reforming existing ones or creating new ones? And clearly, it would be insane to get rid of all existing institutions, but it's probably not wise either just to rely on reform. And that's almost never worked in any other field, only to rely on reforming existing institutions rather than sometimes creating new ones with new methods, new ethos, new relationships with the public. There's then a question of really how far do we go? I mean, we're having this conversation in part because of the extraordinary changes in the last 5 or 10 years, which means that organizations are partly liberated from constraints of both space and time. So by space, I mean things like Zoom, Teams, etc., which mean that an organization can more easily be based all over the world, but also time. And I'm increasingly interested in how large language models can be used for serial deliberation. I taught a course this year at UCL on AI, the practicalities of AI in government and public services, which is a whole other topic to discuss. But one of the exciting things beginning to happen is post OpenAI, Claude, and all these others, is things like Socrasynth, or for a time the Habermas machine, which use large language models to help think in parallel alongside human groups much, much faster than was ever possible in the past. And then there's a question of repertoire. If you go to a hospital, I think this is UCLH, you see all these different services, all these different tools, all these different specialisms. That's what makes a hospital good. And I'm fairly sure in institutional architecture, the same is true. We need lots of different options. One of the ways government reform has often gone wrong in the past is people become fixated on one idea and then try and apply it to everything. And it may work well for some of those things, but then it works really badly for others. It's an obvious point, but it repeatedly gets forgotten in relation to public policy and governments. So the question in a way is, what is the repertoire? Do we need some maybe much faster institutions which only exist for a few months in an emergency, some much slower, like for infrastructure investment, some which really can mobilize command in a crisis, some much more distributed, some really emphasizing public engagement and dialogue, others much more perhaps technocratic, and so on. I'm pretty sure we need a wide menu and repertoire, not one size fits all. And then finally, how do we build trust? So I mentioned the problems of trust. This is a chart from, I guess, about a year and a half ago, different countries. The UK is the far right on that. Low or no trust in government is not a great picture, as you can see, but a lot of other countries are not much better. And one of the many interesting things about research on trust in government is it shows that when people feel they have a say, they have a voice, they do trust government more. And also when they have day-to-day interactions with public agencies, they tend to trust them more. So perhaps we shouldn't be so surprised that government, which has become so distant, so unresponsive to citizen voice, has become rather less trusted, even though perhaps those institutions where there is a day-to-day interaction are a bit more trusted, and that's the point of this chart. So I'll finish really by sort of posing a question, because I'm hoping that some people on the call might be eligible for the Nobel Prize for Economics in 2050, or maybe 2060. I don't know how fast these things move. So if Darren Acemoglu was right, that institutions are the fundamental cause, not just of growth, he's mainly talking about economic growth, but he's also talking about democracy and societal thriving in a much wider sense. If he was right about the last half century, what's the equivalent analysis for the next half century? What ideas do we need to understand what kinds of designs will most set us up for an era, perhaps of trade wars, aging, ubiquitous AI, inequality, and so on, and which ones won't? And my hope is, I'm certain I'm not going to be able to answer that question, but I hope that some people in places like UCL now, some really smart young researchers will have some good answers and may get some grand reward in 25, 30 years' time from now, but also hopefully will have helped the world navigate its challenges. Thank you.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Jeff. Really appreciated that talk and some wonderful examples and insights. We have quite a few questions, or we've got 3 questions that have already been entered into the Slido, so that's great. And I'll take this chance just to remind you that if you want to ask a question, to use the Slido. It's all the information is in your Eventbrite invitation. But I'm going to take advantage of my position and start with the first question. And I think you've given us a vision of things that need to change. You've given us ideas about the direction of change and what change could look like. And so I want to flip it on its head and say, what would you keep? What of sort of the existing way institutions work, maybe in the UK or elsewhere, do you think really needs to be protected from the chainsaw? So I'm curious, amongst all this change, amongst all this need for innovation, what do we want to hold on to? So I'll start with that question, and then I'll give you some from the chat.
It's a great question, and we do need continuity. The last month or so saw the election of a new pope in an institution which is 2,000 years old. And I think it's important to our well-being as humans that there is some predictability and legibility. So institutions like the NHS, the BBC, and so on, I think are definitely ones worth not just keeping, but improving. Um, and you don't want your constitution, your basic sort of democratic machineries to change too often because they depend on being, like I say, solid, predictable, and legible. Probably, though, even in the cases of the BBC and the NHS and others, their front end, as it were, where they interact with citizens, needs to be fairly stable and predictable. But there's probably a lot they can do in the back office, which is much more radical, much more fundamentally changing. But the public don't have to see all of that. There's the front door and the back door in any institution. And while we do need to keep things, the problem is, our risk is that they will soak up all the money, all the resources, and the new tasks don't get any. And in a way, that's what's happened in our health system in the last 10 years. The hospitals have had a higher proportion of budgets, even though pretty much every health expert for probably 30 years has said you need to move money out of the hospitals into the community, into self-care, mutual care, things like mental health. So we've got to be a little bit careful about how we answer that question,
Mm.
because probably more often the old institutions are hoarding too much power and too much money rather than the opposite. But I'm not a revolutionary. I don't think it'd be good to scrap everything. And every time there has been a complete scrapping of existing institutions, many, many people have suffered before they've got any benefits.
That's yeah, absolutely. And I maybe have a quick follow-up. Some of the discussions that you were talking about was sort of new types of services, new ways of delivering. But I think I heard less about actually these back office functions
Mm.
around reporting, around financing, around HR functions, around progression and recruitment. Could you speak a little bit to sort of some of those, yeah, the back office work and how that needs to change in order to do these new types of programs and new types of delivery?
So the formula I often use with governments is that they need to be good at three things: the poetry, which is the sort of big story of what they're trying to achieve; the prose, which is the policies and programs; and then the plumbing, which is the kind of the boring back office. And I'm
Exactly.
in an engineering department. I'm probably more aligned with the plumbing bits. And I didn't mention in my talk a thing I published last week through the Demos think tank on Doge, and it was called Doge Done Better.
Hmm.
And it was on, if you were a government wanting to get some savings and so on, it set out in quite boring detail how you would do the plumbing of a more effective kind of Doge. Now, that's never going to be of interest to the
Hmm.
media or most of the politicians. But if they don't attend to the
Yeah.
plumbing sort of holds them up. And one of my worries about the current British government, it's got very few people in its senior ranks who are actually that interested in the how, the practicalities of plumbing. And it matters partly because the options for plumbing are so different from 20 or 30 years ago, thanks to mainly to digital AI and so on. And you're much less likely to deliver your purposes, your goals, if you don't deal with that boring stuff. But if anyone's interested, please read Doge Done Better and tell me what's wrong with it, or tell me how you would do better than me. It's not hard to do better than Elon Musk, but I think that's the challenge anyway.
Great. So the next question I've popped in the chat, but I'll read it out loud too, is really around timeframes. So, new initiatives, these big changes, they take a while to unfold. They might only have impacts in the mid to long term as well. And so how do you reconcile that need to innovate with electoral cycles, with swings in public opinion? How would you how would you advise on that issue?
So I guess I've been living that question for 25, 30 years since I ran the UK government strategy unit. And we were set up precisely with the remit not to be trapped by the short term, the constraints of the next announcement, or even the electoral cycle, but to look at 10, 20, 30-year time horizons. And I think we did quite a good job. Most of the things we worked on actually worked, but they often took 10 to 20 years to work, like reducing UK carbon emissions, or cutting teenage pregnancy, or turning around poor estates, or and so on. And I think this is now a problem in almost every democracy. On the one hand, I think you do need some teams in the centers of government who are taking that long time horizon. There aren't any in the UK at the moment. I hope next year this will be fixed. I think there's an institutional need, probably, for different ways of organizing decisions on the four or five key topics which have to transcend electoral cycles. Pensions is one,
Mm.
and I oversaw one big pensions reform. Infrastructure investment is obviously the other. Climate strategy is a third. And those probably need cross-party structures which are a little bit arm's length from the day-to-day political battles, but not depoliticized. And then I think one of the things which the future generations question, and what's happening in Wales and Brussels is posing, is what are the methods for
Mm.
ensuring decisions taken today don't ruin the lives of
Yeah.
people in 30 or 40 years' time. And so I've been working, again, this is really plumbing stuff, on what does that mean for public finance
Yeah.
design? At the moment, we do take an investment approach to airports or roads or buildings, but humans, we treat as an annual spending, an annual cost. And this is insane because humans last longer than infrastructures now. The average life expectancy, 85, 90, 100, is
Mhm.
longer than a typical building or airport. So the fact that our public finance methods have fallen so behind the reality of what governments are doing is a big problem. And there's a whole agenda, I think, of redesigning the methods as well as the institutions to ensure there is at least some better balance of the short term, the medium term, and the long term. And given that many people on this call will live to 100 or more, the fact that 10 years is thought to be very long term is again a kind of slightly crazy distortion in how we think about choices.
Excellent. I think you've actually touched on a few of the themes coming up in the question. So hopefully, even though I'm not going to be able to get to everyone's, you're engaging with the queries already. We have a nice one that's just come in on collective imagination, which I know is something you care a lot about. So maybe if you could define that, but then go into it a little bit more. The question was, what role can collective imagination play in helping both the public and governments step away from government models that are no longer serving us? And particularly the good part of the question, any examples?
Yeah. So, as you say, Kate, I became a bit more obsessed with imagination a few years ago, partly as I realized that so many people could picture ecological disaster or
Yeah.
technological futures, but even very well-informed people struggled to describe or picture what could democracy or health or welfare be like, 30, 40 years from now. And I published a couple of books on partly on the how do you do this better. One of the other prompts for this was the 2008 financial crash, when a review was done on it by the British Academy. It concluded the biggest cause of the crash was a failure of collective imagination.
Mhm.
And the 9/11 Commission in the US concluded the same about the single most important cause of that disaster was a failure of collective imagination. So it clearly matters. And for me, one of the missing things which I feel we need much more of is quite detailed, practical work on, for example, what could care look like? Care for the
Mhm.
elderly 20, 40 years from now. Um, Teal, the Institutional Architecture Lab, is working with the Finnish government on this and with some others, trying to just explore different ways of thinking about buildings, about service design, about self-help, mutual help, and so on, almost from a blank sheet of paper.
Yeah.
Given if there weren't too many constraints, there will always be some. What might be possible? Or think of a city 20 years from now when you might have entirely driverless cars and micromobility, but also much more pedestrians, many more cyclists, and so on. Again, start from scratch, imagine an entire world, as it were, reimagined. That will be pretty difficult to achieve. You then got to compromise with the realities of today and pathways. But I think we need that imagination. I think we really badly need at least some sense of where we might want to get to in order to make better choices today. And an enormous amount is invested in doing that for AI and robotics and
Yeah.
technologies, but almost nothing is spent on doing that for the social world we live in, which is probably more important for our ability to thrive.
So we just have 5 minutes left before closing, and so I'm going to combine two questions, which hopefully will be sort of the send off, what people leave with. So one question was, I'd like to convert all of this to something more tangible. What's the blueprint? And then sort of a very pithy complement to that question, who, what, why, where, how, when. So, or maybe that's six questions. Um, but I think if we've just got a few minutes left, if you're going to send everyone off with the blueprint, the building blocks, the three things they need to remember, the who, what, why, where, when, how. Yeah, what do you want to sort of close on in terms of really key takeaways for those who want to get this done?
Okay, well, thank you for those uh, rather very good but rather difficult questions.
Yeah.
So, what I hope, as I said at the beginning, I hope to persuade you there's a problem. I think we need public institutions. In my view, most of human progress in the last 200 years has come essentially from good institutions in health, supporting children, public health, water, infrastructure, you name it, democracy. They're all based on institutions. We would be living much more miserable, much shorter lives if it wasn't for public institutions. And yet, our current ones are no longer really working. They're neither very competent nor
Mm.
very trusted. So that's the first point, and that's not a position shared by most people. So I should say that's a very much a minority position.
So
If
that's
you
your why
accept
question. That's
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 the
the
one.
why tick.
If you accept that, then the what
Yeah.
is to recognize I'm not advocating a single model as the answer to everything. I'm saying what's the opposite. We need a menu, a suite, a repertoire of often very different tools for the multiple governance tasks we have, from the governance of outer space to AI in the economy to something like mental health in a city. And that's what I want the universities to be working on, and the experts and others, to ensure there is a properly understood repertoire, as there is in fields like engineering or architecture for building houses. We don't want every house to look exactly the same. And that then turns to the how, which is the who, what, why, and when. For this agenda to work, you have to have someone who feels they need a new kind of institution. So taking mental health, in Australia, for example, has been starts creating new institutions for mental health services in states like Victoria. That's then the prompt for bringing together the people who might need it, might work in it, to use their imagination, to look at different options, but then crucially, in my view, not to jump straight to a blueprint, let
Mm.
alone an organogram of the kind you'll get from a big consultancy at great expense, but actually more evolutionary models of learning by doing, things which can uh, try stuff out in the world. And I guess if there's one final point I'd make, it's this. I realize much of our work we've been doing in this space, some of it's prompted by computer science and digital, but even more of it, I think, comes from just thinking biologically, learning
Mm.
from nature about how evolution works, how evolution multiplies opportunities, how organic metaphors of the myceliums and coral reefs and swarms and so on may be more useful to solving next generation problems than inventing another agency which looks exactly like the ones set up in 1990 or 1950. And my hope is, with lots of brain power mobilized on all of this, we won't get quick results, but maybe by 2040, 2050, it will just be obvious that the public sector is refreshed and renewed, is
Mm.
competent, and it's trusted, and actually feels good about itself. And
Mm.
last week, I was at the Creative Bureaucracy Festival in Berlin, an extraordinary event
Yes,
with 2,000
that's
plus
fantastic.
people from around the world. In a sense, that's its mission. We need bureaucracy. We can't avoid it for good lives, but we've got to escape the prisons of now anachronistic ways of thinking and anachronistic cultures which no longer serve us well.
Well, I think that's a fantastic note to end on, breaking that iron cage, breaking that assumed way of doing things. And so, Jeff, I want to thank you so much for your time, for sharing this, for that sort of call to arms at the end. And I really want to thank the organizers and thank everyone who joined. There were some fantastic questions in the chat, and I'm sorry we weren't able to get to all of them, but I can see everyone is engaged in thinking, and that's really what these lunchtime lectures are for. So thank you to everyone. Thank you, Jeff, and I hope you have a wonderful rest of your day.
Thank you, Kate.